Page 276, continued, Chapter 8. How feudal was Indian feudalism? Several scholars have questioned the use of the term, quote, feudalism, unquote, to characterize the early medieval socio-economic formation in India. 1. But the points raised by Harbans Mukhia, too, deserve serious attention. According to him, unlike capitalism, feudalism is not a universal phenomenon. But in my view, tribalism, the Stone Age, the Metal Age, and the advent of the food-producing economy are universal phenomena. They do indicate some laws conditioning the process and pattern of change. Para. Tribalism is universal and continues to be followed by different forms of state and class society. Tribal society has many variations. It can be connected with any of the modes of subsistence such as cattle and other type of pastoralism, and hoe, H-O-E, and plow, agriculture. Agriculture requires cooperation and settlement at one place and creates a lasting base for the tribal establishment. Many tribal societies practice shifting or swidden cultivation, S-W-I-D-D-E-N. But an advanced type of agriculture produces substantial surplus and creates dents in tribal homogeneity, H-O-M-O-G-E-N-E-I-T-Y. Conditions emerge for the rise of classes based on status and wealth, and above all for the large-scale exploitation of the bulk of the kinspeople by a few at the top. In such a situation, the tribal system gets corroded. Para. Similarly, although tribal society is organized on the principle of kinship, this organization could have wide variations. Some form of organizations inherited from the band society needed for hunting and fishing is developed further at the tribal stage. Production efforts need cooperation and division of labor. In the horticultural stage, this could be done on a matriarchal basis, and in the plough agriculture stage on the patriarchal. In the horticultural stage, this could be done on a matriarchal basis, and in the plough agricultural stage on the patriarchal basis. Cooperative production could also be based on a combination, page 277, of the two, and in fact could rest on an organization based on different kinds of kinship, permutations and combinations. Marriage practices and laws of, quote, property, unquote, inheritance may differ from one tribal society to another, and may differ even among members of the same tribe. In some kin-ordered communities, elders arrange the marriage of their king's people in order to exercise some authority over them. In other communities, privileged elders are concerned with regulating the marriages of only close kinspeople so that their social identity is maintained. The mass of the ordinary kins is left free to marry and reproduce as it chooses. But in spite of these variations, tribal society has been found on a universal scale. Therefore, the concept of tribe is useful even for an understanding of the social formations contained in written texts. Para. It is not necessary to posit the diffusion of tribal society, although this may have taken place in certain cases. While feudalism does not seem to be as universal as tribalism, in the Old World it was undoubtedly more widespread than the slave system. The concept of the peasant society is still nebulous. If a peasant society is a system in which the priests and warriors live on the surplus produced by peasants, augmented by the activities of the artisans, such a society existed in many parts of the Old World. Tribalism, quote, the peasant society, unquote, or the slave system could have originated due to internal and slash or external factors. Similarly, it is not necessary to think in terms of the diffusion of the feudal system, although this occurred in certain cases. For instance, Norman feudalism in England was a result of the Norman conquest. Para. But there could be some enormous variations in tribal society as also in the nature of feudal societies. Marx stated that feudalism assumes different aspects and runs through its various phases in different orders of succession. 3. But certain characteristics remain the same. This is admitted even by the critics of Indian feudalism. 4. Feudalism has to be seen as a mechanism for the distribution of the means of production and for the appropriation of the surplus. It may have certain broad universal features and it may have certain traits typical of a time and territory. Though land and agricultural products play a decisive role in pre-capitalist class societies, the specificities of land distribution, page 278, and the appropriation of agricultural products differ from region to region. It cannot be argued that what developed in pre-capitalist Western Europe was the same as in India and elsewhere. Neither do historical laws work in this manner, nor can feudalism be regarded as the monopoly of Western Europe. It is not possible to have a clear-cut formula about feudalism. The most that one could say about the universal aspect of feudalism would be largely on the lines of Mark Bloch, M-A-R-C-B-L-O-C-H, and E.A. Kosminski, K-O-S-M-I-N-S-K-Y. Footnote 5. Feudalism appears in a predominantly agrarian economy which is marked by a class of landlords and one of subject peasantry. In this system, the landlords extract surplus produced by social, religious, or political means, which are called extra-economic methods. This seems to be more or less the current Marxist view of feudalism, which considers serfdom, quote, scalar, S-C-A-L-A-R, property, unquote, and, quote, parcellized, P-A-R-C-E-L-L-I-C-D, sovereignty, unquote, as features of the West European version of the feudal system. The lord-peasant relationship is at the heart of the matter, and the exploitation of the estate by its owner, controller, enjoyer, or beneficiary is its essential ingredient. Apart from these basic universal aspects, feudalism may have several variations. The particularities of the system in some West European countries do not apply to the various types of feudalism found in other areas. For example, evidence of peasant struggles against landlords in other countries has not been explored in sufficient degree. Similarly, artisanal and capitalist growth within the womb of feudalism seems to be typical of the West European situation where agricultural growth and substantial commodity production created major structural contradictions. The nature of religious beneficiaries who appropriated a major portion of land also varies from country to country. Thus, the Church owned a substantial amount of land in Portugal. Buddhist and Confucian establishments controlled land in Korea, and Buddhist monasteries were also important in eastern India. Temples emerged as estate owners in South India, and many Brahmanas enjoyed a similar position in the upper and middle Ganga basin, central India, the Deccan and Assam. In North India, religious grantees did not have to pay taxes to the state, although they fulfilled other obligations. But in Orissa and South India, in many cases, they have to pay taxes. Page 279. Non-religious landed intermediaries also appear in different forms in various parts of India and the world. In certain regions of India, for example, in Orissa, we find tribal chiefs elevated to the position of landlords. In other regions, many administrative officials enjoyed land taxes from the peasants. In spite of these variations, the basic factor, namely the presence of a controlling class of landlords and a subject peasantry, remained the same in early medieval times and did not change until the 16th century, when the central authority became stronger. Para. Again, the degree of the servility of the peasants to the landlords differed from region to region, as also the composition of the cultivating class. The development of agriculture, handicrafts, commodity production, trade and commerce, and urbanization created conditions for differentiation in the ranks of the peasantry. The peasants who produced more than their subsistence requirements could buy their freedom by paying money in lieu of labor service, provided such a practice was favored by the state and a reasonable extent of a market economy was available. Peasants could also be reduced to a state of further penury, and rich peasants could prosper at their cost. But where such developments did not take place, a more or less homogeneous peasantry continued. However, different farming techniques and the name of the soil affected agricultural yields and created variations. Para. Similarly, peasants could be compelled to work as serfs on the farms of the landlords in addition to working on their own farms. This was a common practice in Western Europe, but serfdom should not be considered identical to feudalism. 6. It was after all a form of servility which kept the peasant bound to the soil and made him work on the farm of his lord. The peasants who were compelled to pay heavy rents in cash and kind to the landlords or were required to render rent as well as labor services were as servile as those who supplied only labor. The degree of servility is different if a peasant has to bear allegiance only to the landlord. If he has to be loyal to both the state and the landlord, it becomes a case of double servility or of divided loyalty. But the fundamental issue is the subjection, page 280, of the peasantry, and this subjection is found in all the situations referred to earlier. There is no doubt that this was a characteristic feature of the early medieval Indian social structure. Para. Harbans Mukhia argues that the peasant in medieval India enjoyed autonomy of production because he had, quote, complete, unquote, control over the means of production. 7. What is the significance of owning the means of production? Do the fruits of production stay with the peasant, or are these substantially siphoned off by the landlord? How does this appropriation become possible? What is the mechanism that enables the landlord to appropriate the surplus? Is it merely because of his control over the means of production, or is it because of his coercive power? Is it extracted through an ideological weapon, such as the peasant's belief that he is duty-bound to pay? The ideology that the landlords are the parents of the peasants' aid is reminiscent of the tribal outlook. But this idea may have been further fostered by the priest/landlords in medieval times. I will not try to answer all these questions, but will take up the problem of the distribution of the resources of production in early medieval India. Para. Obviously, land was the primary means of production, but thinking in terms of exclusive control over land by one party makes it extremely difficult to understand the distribution of land. It should be made clear that in early medieval times on the same piece of land, the peasants held inferior rights and the landlords held superior rights. The peasant may have possessed land, labor, cattle, and agricultural implements, but how effective was his quote, control unquote, over the means of production? Did other conditions such as taxes, forced labor, and constant interference by ever-present beneficiaries make the peasants' control really operational? The peasant class was like the proverbial goose that lays the golden eggs. The peasants were allowed to stay alive and multiply themselves, but were not given effective control over the means of production. Para. In fact, land grants leave no doubt that the landlord largely controlled the means of production. Why did the landlords claim various types of rents from the peasants, and how could they collect the rents? Clearly, they did so on the strength of royal charters which conferred on them either villages or pieces of land, or the right to taxes. Page 281. Why did the king claim taxes? In the past, the king claimed taxes on the ground that he afforded protection to the people. According to early medieval law books, the king, however, claimed taxes in his capacity as landowner. 9. Numerous epithets underline the king's ownership of land in early medieval times. 10. He delegated this royal authority by a charter to the beneficiary, who then claimed taxes. The king was called Bhumida, Bhumidh, or giver of land. It is repeatedly said that the merit of giving land accrues to him who possesses it. Stop 11 para. Generally, the early charters gave the beneficiary unfructuary rights, but the later charters granted such concessions as rendered the beneficiary the de facto owner of the village land. The donated village/villages constituted his estate. For example, the beneficiary was entitled to collect taxes, all kinds of income, all kinds of occasional taxes, and this, quote, all unquote, Sarva 12 was never specified. Similarly, he was entitled to collect proper and improper taxes, 13, fixed and unfixed taxes, 14, and at the end of the list of taxes, the term etc., within bracket RD, ADI, comma, RDCUM, ADIKAM bracket closed, 15 was added. All this enormously increased the power of the beneficiary. These extraordinary provisions could serve as a self-regulatory mechanism as and when production increased, 16, but they could also obstruct the expansion of production. Some provisions clearly created the superior rights of the beneficiary in the land held by the peasants. For instance, the Gupta and post-Gupta charters of Madhya Pradesh, northern Maharashtra, Konkan, and Gujarat empower the beneficiary to evict old peasants and introduce new ones. He could also assign lands to others. A similar provision occurs in later Chola charters, 17. But it is taken to mean that the beneficiary could vary the rates of taxation and impose additional dues and services. In any case, all such privileges create for the beneficiary superior rights in the land occupied by the cultivator. Most grants after the 7th century AD gave way villages along with lowlands, fertile lands, water reservoirs, various trees and bushes, pathways and pastures. Charters from eastern India grant the village along with mango trees, mahua, bracket, Bassica latifolia, bracket closed, and jackfruit trees and various other agrarian resources. They also grant cotton, hemp, coconut and areca nut trees, though this happens mostly after the 10th century when cash crops assume importance. Such provisions, page 282, render the agrarian production dependable on the beneficiary, for almost all communal agrarian resources are transferred to him. Without free access to community resources, the peasant's autonomy in production cannot be ensured. Plough agriculture depended entirely on the case of cattle. What a peasant possessed was not sufficient to feed his cattle. For this purpose, continued unrestricted use of the common pasture resources was essential. But the grant of these resources to the beneficiary created a difficult situation. We could visualize several restrictions on the use of the common pastures. The beneficiary could appropriate the best pasture grounds for his own cattle, could allocate the resources to peasant families on certain conditions, or even bar their access to the grazing fields as a measure of coercion. Therefore, the grant of pasture resources to the beneficiaries considerably curbed the autonomy and process of peasant production. That the peasants' control over production was undermined is supported by many inscriptional passages which specify privileges for the beneficiaries of land grants. Listed and explained by D.C. Sarkar, these passages number 305, which may not be exhaustive, for many land grants have appeared since 1966, when Sarkar's book was published, 18. However, his list clearly shows the beneficiary's right to forced labor and eviction of tenants, and also his control over pastures, water, and other rural resources. In some cases, a village was granted along with its inhabitants, who are sometimes identified as belonging to 18 communities. 19. This type of grant ensured the dominance of the grantee over rural households. Evidently, in the areas in which the grantees enjoyed such privileges, the peasant could have only a nominal autonomy in production. Para. We have to appreciate that only a free exercise of agrarian rights can make a household unit effective in production. Till recent times, the powerful landlords barred the weak and helpless peasants from exercising such rights and could make their life impossible. Of course, the caste system helped this process. The untouchables could not use public tanks or wells. Even if they possessed their piece of land, how could they function independently in production? Para. Most charters ask the peasants to carry out the orders of the beneficiaries. 20. These orders, page 283, cover not only the payment of taxes which are concerned with the fruits of production, but also relate to the means and processes of production. In a way, the blanket authority to extract obedience from the peasant places him at the beck and call of the beneficiary. It implies general control over his labor power, which may be used either in the fields cultivated by him or in those directly managed by the beneficiary. The beneficiaries may insist on growing certain types of produce for their ostentatious and unproductive consumption, and on the strength of their seigneurial SEIGNEURIAL rights, they can compel the peasants to produce those cereals or cash crops which they need. Para. We may also note that the law books of Yagnavalkya, Brihaspati and Vyasa specify 4 graded stages of land rights in the same piece of land. Thus, we hear of Mahipati, Kshetra Swamin, Karshaka, and the subtenant or leaseholder. 21. It is important that the medieval jurists understood Swamitva in the sense of ownership and Swatta in the sense of property, and this was considered to be a significant distinction in Hindu law. 22. The Swamin therefore could be equated with the landed beneficiary and the Karshaka or the Kshetraka with the rent-paying tenant peasant. Multiple hierarchical rights and interest in land, which was the chief means of production, can be inferred even from Gupta land sale transactions. These transactions not only indicate the interest of the king, but also of the local administrative body, Adhikarana, dominated by powerful men. They also mention the beneficiaries and the rights of the occupier of the land, 23. Of course, several Gupta transactions do not mention any occupier, though it appears that money for the purchase of land is paid not only to the Adhikarana, but also probably to the occupier. These typical land transactions are found in Bangladesh. But in the grant system, which became widespread in post-Gupta times, the local Adhikarana disappeared and was generally not consulted when land grants were made. Para. Hierarchical control over land was created by large-scale sub-infeudation, especially from the 8th century onwards. 24. This appears in both North and South India. At one stage under the Cholas, there were as many as 5 grades in its landed hierarchy. It consisted of the king on top, followed by the assignee, page 284, and then the occupant who leased land to the sub-occupant who finally got it tilled in the cultivating tenant. 25. Sub-infeudation gave rise to a hierarchy of landlords different from the actual tillers of the land. Such a process seems to be on line with a significant observation of Marx on feudalism. According to him, quote, feudal production is characterized by division of soil amongst the greatest possible number of sub-feudatories, stop unquote, 26.